I didn't hear your last answer.
Didn't we just have this argument?
Criteria like for
Oh,
experiencing God.
I'm still waiting for an answer to my question. Do you have? Okay, do you believe in things that you don't have experience in? You don't have experience in the laws of nature, do you? Maybe I'm wrong. Do you have experience in the laws of logic? I guess you're going to have to not have belief in them too. Otherwise, your criterion for God, that you disbelieve in him because you don't have an experience of him, is because it's an arbitrary criterion.
Darth, you're a Christian, right?
Yeah, I'm still waiting for an answer.
Right. Can we talk about Jesus?
Professor, I'm waiting for an answer.
Is
Can we
anyone
talk about
interested
Jesus?
in hearing about my argument for the conclusion that Jesus died twice?
Okay.
So no, I want to hear this professor guy actually answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not asking you loaded questions. These are certainly very legitimate and germane to your position. If
Right.
you withhold belief in God because you don't have experience of God, therefore, if that's not an arbitrary criterion, then you must withhold belief in all those things that you don't have experience of. So, do you have experience of the laws of nature? Professor?
No.
So is your criterion an arbitrary one?
No.
Okay, then why do you believe there are laws of nature?
I do not believe that the laws of nature are something to be experienced.
Then why don't you withhold belief in them?
Category of things that require experience.
Why would God require an experience but not the laws of nature?
Parallel to the laws of logic? Is he in the same category?
Well, it kind of, because you see, the God would be the ultimate nature of reality upon which everything hangs on for its existence. And since you're going to withhold belief in God, which would be the ultimate nature of reality, if you will, because you don't experience it, then if you simply believe that the ultimate nature of reality are the laws of nature, in order for you to be consistent, you'd have to have experience of the laws of nature. Now, are the laws of nature, as far as you're concerned, the ultimate nature of reality? And why would you believe in them if you don't have experience in them? After all, you told me your criterion isn't arbitrary.
I'm not quite sure what you're looking for.
I'm trying to find an answer where you recognize that your criterion for God is an arbitrary one, not a consistent one. Otherwise, you'd have to abandon belief in the laws of nature, laws of logic, as well as other core beliefs about the nature of reality that you hold to.
Well, but he might have criteria that's worked for all his life for predicting true things that come true, and he might be satisfied with that, right? And yet there isn't something equivalent for the belief in God.
Right. The standard way to defend our belief in the laws of nature is inductively. And now what Darth is going to do, I predict, is to ask us what it is that justifies induction. And of course, what he's looking for is for us to justify the uniformity of nature. And then he's going to try to argue that the uniformity of nature is not the sort of thing that can be justified in a non-Christian worldview.
So you're looking at the uniformity of nature in the rearview mirror. You're looking at the uniformity of nature in the rearview mirror and saying, oh, well, yeah, we see the uniformity of nature, but it just is. Is that what you're saying?
I never said the uniformity of nature just is. In fact, I never even said what my view on the uniformity of nature was.
I think it's peculiar that when trying to talk to Christians,
exactly,
they don't want to talk about Jesus.
Why exactly are we compelled to believe that there are laws of nature in the first place? Why not just think that there's sort of, the patterns of instantiations of various properties?
Well, look, there's two views in contemporary philosophy on what the laws of nature are. one view about the laws of nature is that the laws of nature are just a description of reality that makes the best trade-off between simplicity and generality. It's a kind of deflationary perspective of what the laws of nature are. Another kind of
But can that
perspective.
give you truth?
Sure. I don't know why I couldn't. But anyway, I'm going to continue.
Really?
with
So
what
that
I'm
can give you a
explanation.
truth statement?
But
Jay
hang on, you have to
Messler,
let
do
me
you hold
complete
to
my
that view?
explanation.
What was
Do you
this
hold to
about?
that view?
Over talking? Something about something over
So the
talking?
question came up as to what the laws of nature were, and I was going to offer two perspectives. I've
Do you
offered
hold to that
one
first one?
perspective.
Stop
And
interrupting them, people. Go ahead, Jamie.
So the first perspective was a kind of deflationary perspective, according to which the laws of nature are the best trade-off between simplicity and generality. And then the other perspective of the laws of nature is
Well, we're interacting with the laws of nature right now. That's how you can know
Something,
that they
something.
exist.
Okay,
so look, the other perspective of what the laws of nature are is what's called.
And his other criterion was he
Stop,
thought God
stop,
was a
stop.
man, and he learned God wasn't. So
The
that doesn't
other-
justify him to abandon his
Johnny,
belief in
Johnny,
God.
shut the fuck up.
Me again.
Okay, everybody
Johnny,
shut the
you're
fuck up.
talking over
The
people,
other-
Johnny.
Yeah, stop. You guys need.
The other explanation as to what the laws of
Excuse
nature
me?
are is
Yeah,
the
okay,
so-called
stop, Jay.
governing
Can we
picture.
stop over talking people?
Excuse me. Whatever your name is, Mesler.
He was talking.
I know he was, but they're talking over each other. I wanted to interject. You guys can please stop talking over each other, cutting each other off, and waiting for a breath so you can jump in. Thank you.
You don't have to announce it. Just mute the person who's over talking.
So the other conception of the laws of nature is the so-called governing picture, according to which, this is a more metaphysically inflationary characterization of the laws of nature, according to which the laws of nature play some causal role in explaining the various kinds of things that we observe in nature, right? So it's sometimes called a kind of Platonic conception of the laws of nature, according to which the laws of nature have some sort of exalted metaphysical status.
Yeah, do you have a justification for the laws of nature?
Do I?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my own picture of the laws of nature is the first picture I was talking about, according to which, that was the deflationary perspective. And my justification for thinking that there is a description of nature like that is our past experience of nature.
Oh, are you using inductive reasoning?
Yes, I am using inductive reasoning.
Okay, is that conclusion logically necessitated?
No, it's not. It's inductive reasoning.
So you're just guessing.
No, I'm not guessing. It's an inductively
Oh.
reached conclusion.
Right, it's inductive, but you see, induction would be based upon past experience, right?
That's right. It's not a deductive
well,
conclusion. It's
why
an
would-
inductive
why would-
conclusion.
Why would the whole of nature necessarily comport and conform itself to what you experience?
I didn't say the whole of nature did do that.
Well, that's the idea of the laws of nature. You don't experience.
No, hang on. I said the laws of nature were a description of nature that made the best trade-off between simplicity and generality. I did not say that the whole of nature comports to some sort of metaphysical rules.
That's what the laws of nature mean.
No, again, I explained that there are two conceptions of the laws of nature in the contemporary philosophical literature. Darth, you're talking over me again.
Yeah, you're repeating yourself. We already heard
Right,
that.
I'm repeating myself because you're either not listening to me or not understanding me.
No, I did
Yes.
listen to you. That's why I said you're repeating yourself.
I know, but regardless of whether or not he's repeating himself, Darth, when you cut people off, it's the same. I've been trying all day to not get us back to where we overtalk each other and we're just rude. So if you could please not.
So, Jay Messler, do the laws of nature, are they consistencies that extend beyond the consistencies of merely what you and humanity experience?
Do they expand beyond our experience? Yes. Well, there's a high probability that nature operates the same way that we have experienced it in the past, beyond those regions that we can directly observe.
Doesn't probability presupposes causality in the laws of nature? Why would you want to invoke a probabilistic
Probability
assessment,
does not
which would be-
presuppose
I'm
the laws
talking-
of
I'm
nature.
talking- Sure it does. How would you have a statistical probabilistic assessment that didn't presuppose causality and the laws of nature? How would you be able to do that?
I didn't say a statistical assessment. I said a probabilistic assessment.
Oh, so an epistemic probability?
That's right. These are epistemic probabilities.
Good. Unpack this for me. What your epistemic your philosophical probabilistic assessment, based upon what?
Upon our past experience of nature.
So does your past experience, does that mean the rest of nature outside of your experience, both past, present, and future, conforms to what you experience?
It doesn't do so deductively, but it does so inductively. It means that I can.
What do you mean it does so inductively? You mean you reason that the whole of nature is consistent, like certain consistencies in your experience? Is that a guess?
No, it's a hypothesis in which I have a high degree of probability.
And what's that? And how do you assess that probability? It's just simply based upon the consistency of past experience?
It's based upon two things. It's based upon past experience, and then it's also based upon that's what the simpler explanation would be. It would be a simpler hypothesis for nature to be consistent, and therefore the objective prior probability of that hypothesis would be higher than the probability of the contrary hypothesis, according to which nature has variation.
A simpler explanation would be a chance universe, Jay Messler.
No, I don't think that would be a simpler hypothesis.
Yeah. In fact, what it would be is you simply have spontaneous events that are not the product of laws and causality. So
a simpler hypothesis is one where you have consistency from one region to another, because otherwise you have to posit that the laws of nature change one region to another, and on that hypothesis you'd have to posit as many laws of nature as there are regions.
You're giving me verbose. You're not giving me brass tacks answers here.
I am giving you a brass tacks answer.
No, you're not. You're simply appealing to your experience.
I'm appealing to two things. I'm appealing to my experience, and I'm appealing to simplicity.
Experience doesn't justify how nature operates outside of your experience.
Yes, it does.
How? Are you omniscient?
No.
Good. Then tell me how you know that the rest of physical reality conforms and comports itself to the consistencies that you experience. How do you know that?
I know that because I have the past experience that I have, and I have judgments about the simplicity of a hypothesis.
How does your past experience dictate that the unexperienced physical reality conforms itself to what you do experience in your past? How does that justify that?
Because that's how induction works, Darth. That would be like asking someone, how do you...
Question. That's right.
It's not begging the question. The thing is that...
If it's not begging the question, then how do you justify that the whole of physicality comports itself to what you experience? How do you?
I've already answered your question.
Saying induction, I'd like to know.
There's no
on my view, induction is justified until we have a defeater for induction.
Is it logically? So until you have a defeater for something, you're justified in begging the question. That be justified.
I am not begging the question.
Hold on a second. Since you experience a series of consistencies, therefore you're justified that the rest of nature operates according to those consistencies. How do you know that those consistencies aren't the product of chance?
I've already answered that question, Darth.
Well,
what I'm appealing to is a principle.
Can chance produce the same type of consistencies?
Could chance produce it? Is that, in other words, are you asking me whether that's a logical possibility?
Can chance produce the same type of consistencies that you surmise that causality or the uniformity of nature produces?
I'm trying to answer your question, but you're going to have to tell me whether you mean that it's logically possible or probable.
I'm asking you if a chance universe where all events were spontaneous and acausal, things just happen, individually they're discrete events, could a chance universe produce any number of series of consistencies?
Okay, I'm going to provide two answers, and I don't want to be interrupted. I want you to listen to these two answers very carefully. So the first one is that the first answer is that a chance universe of the sort that you describe is logically possible. And the second layer to my answer is that it's nonetheless a very improbable hypothesis, that the more probable hypothesis.
What do you mean improbable?
Hang on, you're interrupting me. I'm trying to answer your question here, but you should not interrupt me.
Complicated questions. I don't need a monologue.
Well, if you don't want to
decide when it's okay to interrupt, Darth.
It's funny, Darth. You don't clarify the question, so he has to give you two different answers because you won't clarify it for him. And then you get upset and you try to fucking interrupt him so he can't actually give the answer to your question. Just shut up and let him give the answer.
So as I was saying, the second layer to the question, which is that if you're asking me about probability, that is to say how I make the inference, then what I want to tell you is that it is a much more probable hypothesis by miles that nature is uniform.
What do you mean by probability? That a causal.
Stop interrupting.
Darth, you need to stop interrupting now. Darth.
Is more probable.
Can you guys mute him while the other person is speaking?
Okay. Darth, if you keep interjecting, I'm going to have to mute you while he finishes and go back to the way we used to in Audius Hangout. Please let him finish. Even if you feel it's long-winded or he's giving a longer dissertation, that is his choice. You need to let him finish first, please.
Right. So what it means to say that something is probable is to say that it is quite likely to be true. And I mean, we could go through a whole theory here of formal epistemology, but I think that would bore everyone. I think the most succinct way to answer the question, why do we think that nature is uniform, is that is for two reasons. First of all, the intrinsic probability of the uniformity of nature is quite high because the intrinsic probability of simpler hypotheses is higher than the intrinsic probability of more complicated hypotheses, and the hypothesis that nature is chancy, which is to say that there's a whole bunch of arbitrary things that happen all over the place for no reason, there's no uniformity, it's a description of a very complicated world. Whereas the description of a uniform world is a description where the same rules apply everywhere and is therefore a simpler world. The other way that we justify our belief in the uniformity of the laws of nature is by appealing to past experience. And we're justified in doing that because in the same way that we're justified in using our other inferential techniques, right? So we have inductive inference, we have deductive inference. We're justified in using both of those on the grounds that that we're justified in using inferential techniques of whatever sort until there are defeaters for them.
When you invoke that it's more probable, when you say probabilistic, does that include the idea that there are non-variables along with variables?
Variable what? I don't understand your question.
Well, when you say that a chance universe is less probable, when you say there's a probabilistic assessment, does probabilistic there contain the idea that there are certain non-variables along with variables? For example, if I had a plexiglass container that, as they show on lottery pickings, we have a fixed number of lottery balls all moving around, pushed by air. So when you say that a chance universe where each and every discrete event that would be acausal or simply spontaneous without a prior cause would be less probable, that probabilistic concept that you're invoking, does that concept contain the idea that there are non-variables as well as variables?
I'm still not sure I understand your question, but I'm going to try to provide an answer. So I think what's going on is that you're mixing the concept of chance on the one hand with the concept of epistemic probability, which is the concept that I'm appealing to, on the other. I want to say that
Very simple question.
I don't think it is simple because again, you're refusing to actually explicate.
Include non-variables and variables.
Variable what, Darth?
Well, in the normal use of the word something is probabilistic, it includes the idea that there's a certain amount of non-variables as well as variables. Now, are you invoking that type of a probabilistic assessment?
What normal usage of probabilistic are you talking about? Do you have a reference?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the usage of the word probable in which there are.
So if I have 1,000 ping pong balls in a plexiglass container, we have certain non-variables such as the number of ping pong balls, and then the variables would be the selection of one or more ping pong balls. So when you say that a chance universe where events are spontaneous and are acausal, that it would be less probable, does that concept of probabilistic that you're invoking, does that include the idea of that there are non-variables and variables?
Again, I want to highlight that I'm not using epistemic probability when I make these probabilistic. Sorry, I misspoke. I am using the notion of epistemic probability. What I'm not using is the notion of chance. So when you talk about these balls that are turning up with numbers and so on, what you're invoking is a conception of probability that comes up when we talk about chancy events. And that's,
I've asked the question 3 times, and all I'm getting.
Yes, I'm now answering your question.
Yeah, I know you're responding, but I'm getting gobbledygook back. Does your concept of a probabilistic evaluation include the idea of that it has non-variables along with variables? Yes or no?
No.
Okay, good. Then explain to me how you have that it's less probable for to be in a chance universe. Unpack that for me.
Again, this is based on the principle that the intrinsic probability of a hypothesis is lower the more complex you make the hypothesis.
What does that mean? Let me ask you this question. When you make a probabilistic assessment about a chance universe, are you doing so in terms of the background that there are some absolutes that exist?
I don't think so.
Oh, so you're making that assessment based upon that there are no absolutes?
I mean, I don't think I'm invoking absolutes at all when I make that assessment.
Okay, so your assessment involves a universe where there are no absolutes.
No, I did not say that. I said that my assessment doesn't appeal to absolutes one way or another. I'm neither assuming that there are absolutes nor that there are no absolutes.
Oh. Well, then how would it actually be meaningful to invoke something if you don't know whether there are absolutes or not, or whether there are no absolutes?
In the same way, we don't have to invoke golf. It's just a different question.
That's not an answer to my question. That's an evasion.
No, I am answering your question.
Okay, so if you don't know whether they're absolutes or not,
I didn't say I didn't know whether they're absolutes. I said I wasn't appealing to absolutes.
In your world, well, you see, you would either be hold to a premise, an unstated premise, that your reasoning is derivative, that there are some absolutes, or your reasoning would hold to an unstated premise that there are no absolutes. Which would that be?
I don't think my reasoning appeals to either of those.
That's absurd.
I'm sorry, but
that's absolutely an incoherent response, because either it is the case that one's reasoning depends on some absolutes, or it is not the case that one's reasoning let me just rephrase that. Either it is the case that your reasoning depends on some absolutes, or your reasoning does not depend on any absolutes at all. Okay, so that statement would be true. Now,
what's up?
Which of those 2 positions would you hold to?
As far as I can tell, my reasoning here is not appealing to absolutes.
Oh, okay, good. Then I can dismiss everything you say, because if your reasoning isn't based upon any absolutes, it's not based upon anything at all.
That's not true.
That's not true. You just got wrecked.
I am appealing to things. I'm just not appealing to absolutes.
Your reasoning doesn't depend on anything that's absolute? Really?
No, I said it doesn't appeal to absolutes. Now, if you want to ask me if there's...
Does your reasoning depend on the existence of any absolutes? Yes or no?
Well, hang on. I think we might be talking past each other. Can you define for me what an absolute is, so I can understand your question?
Something that would be completely unchanging.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that there are absolutes.
Okay, good. So your reasoning depends on some absolutes. Is that correct?
Sure.
Good. Could you tell me what those absolutes are?
Yeah, so one absolute that I might believe in is the law of non-contradiction.
Good. Can you tell me how you know that it's universal and invariant at all times and all places?
Definition.
The law... Sorry, are you done? Yeah, so the law of non-contradiction is necessarily true, and we recognize that the law of non-contradiction is necessarily true by understanding.
How do you know it's
this?
necessary?
Right, I was about to say that. So we know that the law of non-contradiction is necessarily true because you recognize what the law of non-contradiction says, and once you recognize and understand what the law of non-contradiction says, you then also understand that it couldn't possibly be false.
How do you know that it couldn't be false?
Because you understand what it says.
Oh, so in other words, something is false, and you understand what it says. So does the law of non-contradiction?
I'm sorry, someone is. There's a lot of static. I can't hear you.
No, somebody's. So when you say you understand the law of non-contradiction, so do you understand what the nature of all entities are?
No, man, I don't have to understand the law of non-contradiction.
Oh, but you told me it was based upon your understanding.
The law, Mike, I noticed the law of non-contradiction is true because of my understanding. You then asked me if I understand all things, and the answer to that question is no.
So the law of non-contradiction holds true somewhere else in reality outside of your experience. Why? Because you hold a belief in your head?
No, it's not because I hold a belief in my head. It's because what the proposition says.
Oh, well, so what if it says the proposition says that?
Because I understand what the proposition says.
Does reality outside of one's sense experience always conforms to some a proposition that somebody thinks or verbalizes?
No, and that's not what I said either.
How do you know that the law of non-contradiction holds at all times and all places, other than you hold it as an idea or verbalize it as a statement?
The reason that I know that the law of non-contradiction is necessarily true is because I understand what the law of non-contradiction says. I already answered that question.
Right. So just because something is stated as a proposition, therefore it's necessarily true outside.
No, that's not what I said. I said that I know that it's true because I understand it. That's the reason. That's how I know that it's true. That's not why it's true.
Understand all of reality.
Okay, Darth, if you guys are going to keep talking over each other, I'm going to do 5 minutes where people are going to talk, the other's going to be muted. If I have to jump in again.
Do you understand all of reality?
No, I do not understand all of reality.
Okay, does that proposition, is that a dictum about how all of reality is?
Yes.
Oh, so you don't understand all of reality, but you can give us a dictum about how all of reality operates, one that you don't understand.
I didn't say I didn't understand it, and nor did I say that I don't. No, I said that I don't understand all of reality. Now, there's a part of all of reality I do understand, which is the law of non-contradiction.
And how do you know that holds in all times and all places?
Because I understand what it says.
That's gobbledygook. That's entirely circular reasoning.
No, it's not. And by the way, your own view is circular, and you tell people.
You understand that the law of non-contradiction holds that for every entity that exists outside of your sense experience, that there's no entity that doesn't conform to the law of non-contradiction? How could you possibly know that?
To put my answer another way, the law of non-contradiction is self-evident.
Evident to what? Your senses or your thinking?
Thinking.
Right, my thinking.
Oh, so if you think all of reality is a certain way, therefore all of reality is that way?
No, I said that. Listen, I said that when a proposition is self-evident, I can then know that that proposition is self-evident by examining that proposition. Now, that doesn't mean that reality has to conform to what I think. It does mean that in the instance of a self-evident proposition, I know that self-evident proposition in virtue of understanding the proposition. But in general, reality is whatever it is, independent of what I think about it.
So do you know, because you have an idea in your head, that for every entity that exists, that there is no entity that couldn't coexist with its negation? How could you possibly know that just from having an idea in your head?
Well, that's not what the law of non-contradiction says. The law of non-contradiction.
Yeah, the law of non-contradiction says A cannot equal not A at all times and all places. So in other words, there couldn't be a small asteroid somewhere in the universe that couldn't exist with it not being an asteroid.
No, what the law of non-contradiction
know that?
says. But what
Okay.
the law of non-contradiction.
Right, Mesner,
Let
I'm
him
sorry
go,
to
Molly. You're
interrupt
fine.
right
You're
quick. No, the thing
Molly,
is,
hold on.
Darth is
He was
going-
about to respond, Molly.
No, but Darth asks him a question, he starts to answer it, and then Darth jumps in again and cuts him off.
They're doing fine, I think.
All right, I'll let
By
it
the
go
way,
then.
you should know.
Go ahead,
Chancellor,
Dan. Go
that,
ahead.
according to certain troglodytes in here, I only converse with white belts, so they must consider you a white belt. What do you think of that, Jay Messler?
No, I think that once you
Do
realize
you
that
consider yourself a white belt, Jay Messler?
Jay, could you describe, the law of non-contradiction, please?
Have to do it. I mean, simple.
Can I talk? So the law of non-contradiction says that the proposition P and not P is necessarily false. Now, what Darth was asking me about was a different proposition, which is that an asteroid could be both itself and not itself.
Well, I could have expressed that better, but I'm trying to express the law of non-contradiction. Okay. Now, are you telling me because you merely hold to an idea as a proposition that all of reality in all instances for all events or entities always conform to that idea that you hold?
Well, it's not a matter of conforming. It's that since P and not
Really?
P.
Really?
Yeah, it's a matter of how he's framing it cognitively.
Look, so let me say this another way. There could not be a state of affairs that would count as P and not P being true.
How do you know that?
Because I understand what the sentence is.
No. How do you understand what the nature of all entities are? How do you know that?
Hang on, I didn't say that I understood what the nature of all entities
Well, that's
is.
what the proposition. The proposition is A representing all entities. A cannot equal not A at the same time in the same sense. So your understanding is a law. It's invariant. It's absolute. It's universal. So you're telling me because you hold an idea, which you call an understanding, that therefore all entities conform to that idea that you hold?
No, see, hang on. There's something important going on here, which is that originally we started with the question, how do I know that the law of non-contradiction is necessarily true? And now Darth appears to have moved to the question, why is the law of non-contradiction true?
No, I'm on the same question. How do
Okay,
you
well,
know
if you-
it's true?
So if you want to know how it's true, if you want to know how it is that I know it's true, the answer is that the law of non-contradiction is self-evident. Now, by the way, it's not about knowing.
What? Your thoughts or your sense perception?
Well, it's my understanding.
Oh, okay. So in other words, every entity, in terms of the law of non-contradiction, conforms to an idea that you have.
So I want to respond to this idea that it has to be a kind of conforming. So it's going to be true that the law of non-contradiction holds in all times and
That
all
was a
places.
question, by the way.
Okay, can you repeat the question? Because I think I missed it.
Yeah. So for every entity necessarily in existence conforms to an idea that you hold in your head. How do you know that?
Well, I see, this is why I wanted to go into conforming, because now you're asking me, how is it that I know that all entities conform to the law of non-contradiction? And what I was about to claim is that even though the law of non-contradiction is true in all times and all places, it's false that objects conform to the law of non-contradiction.
A represents entities, does it not?
So the law of non-contradiction concerns propositions and not entities.
Right.
So this is why I wanted to.
I'm simplifying it for the sake of the conversation.
But when
Okay?
you simplify it this way,
So A representing a proposition about reality and or an entity, okay, it always conforms to your idea that it's universal.
No,
So
it's
you
not
don't
a
know
matter
by
of.
expe-
It's
so you
not a
don't
matter.
know by experience, right? You don't know by experience. Is that correct?
It's correct that I don't know by experience the law of non-contradiction is true.
So all entities represented by a proposition necessarily conform to an idea that you have?
But hang on, again, I wanted to challenge this idea of conforming.
That was a question, my friend.
Right, and it's a question that has a false presupposition.
What's the false presupposition?
that in order for the law of non-contradiction to be universally true, it would have to also be the case that objects conform to the law of non-contradiction.
It doesn't matter whether you say objects, entities, or propositions. It's neither here nor there. You're being entirely evasive, which I understand why you're doing it.
I'm not being evasive.
Listen, when it comes to propositions about entities or events, okay, do they owe those events or entities and propositions that represent them outside of your experience? Do they always conform to certain ideas that you have about certain universal conditions? Do they always conform to that?
No.
Oh, then how do you know that they do?
Hang on. I want to point out something crucial I pointed out before.
Listen, I'm done. I think I proved my point. You're not going anywhere.
I am going.
Darth, you did horrible, by the way.
He just realized you're not a white belt.
Darth, you did horrible, by the way.
He just realized you're not a white belt, and so
can I finish my? It looks like he left, but I want to finish my. I want to finish my point. So the issue here was that we were first talking about how do I know that the law of non-contradiction is true, and then I put forward the standard line about it being self-evident, and then he was asking me if the objects conform to that law because of something that I understand. And of course, it's not because of something I understand that the law of non-contradiction is true. And that's how I know it, not like what makes it the case. And so it's, it has nothing to do with my understanding that it's like that, And moreover, the other problem was that to say that something is conforming means, that makes it sound as though objects are caused to be as they are by the law of non-contradiction. But I don't think that it's a matter of like the law of non-contradiction causing anything. I think it's that it would be impossible for a state of affairs to be such that the law of non-contradiction didn't hold.
Right.
I don't think there could be like a true contradiction or parallel logic or anything like that.
Well, so if you want to get into those sorts of issues, then I'd have to deliver you a much more sophisticated response than what I gave to Darth. Sort of my strategy in this case was to present a kind of standard epistemological position, which was a kind of internalist foundationalism that in some sense neighbors Darth's, but that is entirely secular. And I think has a number of advantages over Darth's position. If you want to go into things like paraconsistent logics, I think in order to do that, you have to actually have a more sophisticated epistemology on the table, but it's also going to be a more sophisticated one than Darth is able to deliver, because he thinks that there couldn't be something that ran counter to the law of non-contradiction. And so Darth isn't going to be happy with paraconsistent logics either.
It's interesting that he concluded that he was losing.
I don't think he concluded he was losing. I thought he concluded that he just wasn't getting anywhere.
Well,
yeah, it wasn't getting anywhere, and that was the point.
You see, when he's not getting anywhere with someone, he persists in making them look like a fool.
Yeah, he must have felt like he couldn't do it.
No, he was just frustrated. Like he got tired because he felt like he had won. I don't know what you guys thought.
He wouldn't have left if he felt that he had won.
It's not true, Jack. He was doing. Look, he gets frustrated even when he's defeating people because he thinks that they're so stupid. Now, I don't think that he thinks that Jay is stupid, right? I'm not saying that, but he gets frustrated because he wants to be able to shut people down, and he wasn't doing that, right? He couldn't stop Jay from talking, which is what he wanted. So that's what he was frustrated by.
Shut down the non-believer.
Yeah. By the way, if anyone in here has any loss. So if anyone in here has any questions about what I was talking about, I'd love to, give a further explication, or if like anyone was unsatisfied with anything that I was saying.
No, you're fine.
Why didn't you ask him? Why didn't you ask him any questions? Why didn't you just say, "Fine, I'll accept anything from whatever conclusion you want to say. I'll accept it for the sake of argument. Now let me see how you answer these questions. Let's see how you solve these problems." Why didn't you do that?
I think that's a good thing to do, and that's a tactic that I've taken in the past with him or other presuppositionalists, and that's something that I don't know if you saw the document I posted above, but in that document I go into an internal critique of presuppositionalism. but this time I wanted to do something I hadn't quite done before, which was to offer up a fairly robust contrary epistemological position, just to see how Darth would react to it.
You didn't offer anything though. He had you like time.
False.
I have a question.
Well, he had him over talked. He didn't really have him.
Well, James,
why don't we have 10
minutes not answering the question, right?
Well,
Ken, why
if
don't
you
you-
think I
why
didn't
don't
answer
you-
a question, I'd be glad to hear what question you don't think I answered, and I'd be glad to answer it.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, it seems like he was asking you some pretty basic questions about the law.
Yeah, what were they? Can we hear from Danny and not Iron? Oh, actually, yeah, Danny, go ahead.
There's something I didn't understand. You know, you gave two reasons for why we would accept. I don't the I forget what the uniformity of nature, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I was questioning about the second one, the simplicity. You know, the more simple. What was it? What? How did you?
Oh, yeah. So this is about the intrinsic probability of a hypothesis. So I don't know if you know what Bayes' theorem is, but basically, you know, what a lot of philosophers think is that as we proceed in inquiry, we update the probability of a hypothesis. The probability of the hypothesis at the beginning is called the intrinsic probability. And there are philosophers who think that there are objective ways of constructing the intrinsic probability of a hypothesis. So, for instance, my dissertation director is someone who thinks that there are objective ways of doing this. And on his view, if a hypothesis is more complex, then it's going to have a smaller intrinsic probability. In the case of the uniformity of nature, you know, imagine that here's one possibility. You have the laws of nature are the same everywhere. Here's a second possibility. On the left-hand side of the universe, the laws of nature are one way, and on the right-hand side of nature, the laws of nature are another. Now, that's a more complicated hypothesis than the first one, because you have to postulate that.
Claimed otherwise, though, right?
Hold on, let him finish.
Let him finish. Yeah, Jesus.
Right. So since you have to postulate this difference between the two sides, that's why it's more complex. Right. So you were gonna ask me something about him claiming otherwise.
Well, no, I wasn't quite done. I mean, I have a very simplistic understanding of what you said, but it seems like, you know, when we try to explain why things are true in science, right, it somehow, at least from what I understand about science, ends up becoming more, like the explanation becomes more mind-boggling and more complicated and more, less simple, I guess, right? And I guess, I don't know if how what you said is applicable to our explanations in science, right? Because, you know, it's very, why are we able to move our hands, right? There's a very complicated, a very, you know, not very simple explanation as to why we can move our hands, right? Even, I mean, I don't know. I didn't know if that's applicable only to, like, the, I guess, philosophical ideas or to scientific truths, or I don't know.
Right. So it sounds like what you're saying is that you know, when we describe the processes that are involved when I move my hand, they're very complex processes, right? There's all of the tendons and so on that are moving in my bones and all the complicated biological processes that, to be honest, I don't understand that are going on. And the answer is that, well, yeah, that is complicated. But, you know, what we're talking about when I talk about the intrinsic probability is the probability the hypothesis starts off with. And when you go through the process of scientific inquiry, you rule out hypotheses as well. And so if you did have some simpler hypothesis about how my hand works, given scientific inquiry, you'd have to rule out maybe some of those simpler hypotheses and then conclude a more complex one. Now I see in the chat that Iron wants me to address why chance is more complicated than the uniformity of nature. And the answer here is that if you lived in a chancy universe, then what would be happening in any given place in the universe would be without it would be without explanation, right? So in other words, it would have, one way to put this is that it has, a hypothesis like that has maximal Kolmogorov complexity. right? So imagine the doing the following. Imagine that I'm a computer scientist and I want to take a file and I want to compress that file. Well, if the file has a lot of repeated information, then I can compress that file down by getting rid of all of the redundant information, right? And so one way of thinking about the complexity of a hypothesis is to see how much you can actually compress that hypothesis. Now, a universe where there's just like a mess of things going on, and there isn't a set of laws to which everything can be reduced. That's a really, really complicated universe. That's a universe that has, in some sense, maximum Kolmogorov complexity. In other words, you can't compress that universe. So that's why it's a more complicated hypothesis than one in which the laws of nature are uniform.
I don't see how that's the case.
Can you tell me what it is that's wrong with the explanation that I gave?
Yeah,
It seems like there's like we could compare two sets of rules, right? In one, there's only one rule: everything happens randomly or by chance, and then in the other, there's like a whole set of laws, like non-contradiction, exclude vanilla, etc. It just seems like the latter case has more assumptions built into it.
Well, hang on. So we have to distinguish between two things. We have to distinguish between the laws of logic on the one hand, which are standardly taken to be necessarily true. And on the other, there are the physical laws. And the physical laws are only, they're understood to be marginally true. They can be different in other possible worlds, in other words. And so if we're talking about the Chauncey universe, in the Chauncey universe, it would still be the case the laws of logic are true, just as they're true in ours. But the physical laws would be different. As you described it, there would be one physical law that everything happens by chance. Nonetheless, you wouldn't be able to compress the events in that universe to that to that law, right? I mean, that law doesn't predict the events in that universe. Whereas in the universe that we live, you're able to compress the whole of nature down to the best sort of explanation that makes a trade-off between simplicity and generality.
I don't see how all the observations in this reality aren't consistent with chance, though.
Well, if the question is, are the observations logically consistent with chance, then the answer is yes, they are logically consistent with chance. But that's not a very good explanation in the sense that it's a very improbable explanation.
How is it improbable, though? You said that we could reduce this reality, it would be more simple. But if this reality could be
Can I just try giving like a analogy? Can I try giving an analogy? Right. Whenever we do statistics, right. So if we look at the smoking population and the non-smoking population, and we say, there's less than a 5% chance that this occurred due to randomness, what do you think we mean?
Who is that directed to?
Ken. Like,
So
how did,
I didn't quite hear what you said.
so like, look, when we do statistics, right, and we say like, what's the chance, right? When we do like just a basic p-value statistic where you looking at two populations, one, let's say that's you gave cigarettes to and the other doesn't, and you ask the question, well, there is some difference between these two populations. What is the probability that the difference was not due to some meaningful distinction, but rather just random error, meaning due to just chance? What do you think that means?
I think there's a simpler way of pushing the intuition.
Okay.
So, Iron, think, say you have a document, right, and in that document you see the numbers 1202 repeated over and over again. 1202 space 1202 space 1202. Okay, those are the numbers. Now, imagine one person tells you, well, I think what's producing that is a program, and that program produces this set of characters in sequence. And another person tells you, well, it's just a random number generator, and that random number generator just happens to be generating those series of numbers. Which is more likely to you?
I think that the account of the program seems more intuitively likely, but I don't think I could justify it. Not unless I could run multiple iterations of like the experiment, right?
No, so you don't have to do that. The reason why the program that deterministically generates those numbers is more probable is because on the hypothesis that it's randomly generated, there's many other sequences that could have been generated. And in fact, on the randomness hypothesis, given a string of numbers generated by that machine, it's of course possible that machine can generate any given sequence, but the most probable sequence that you're going to see is one that has high Kolmogorov complexity. Because those are, because of all the possible sequences that it could generate, that's the most probable sequence.
Yeah, I mean, you've said that multiple times. I don't know. I haven't heard a justification for why that's the case.
Right. Well, in the case of the computer program, we can do this just on the basis of simple combinatorics. So if you imagine actually sitting down with a computer program and like having it spit out all of these numbers, if you then count the number of results that have high Kolmogorov complexity and that are spat out by the random machine, you'll see that there are many more results that have high Kolmogorov complexity than results that have low Kolmogorov complexity. Now, if you turn to the deterministic program that just spits out like 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, right? And that's what it's programmed to do. Then there's only one outcome that it can make. And so the most probable outcome from that machine is one where it just makes the outcome that you observe.
Does that feature multiple iterations or no?
You don't have to do multiple iterations to notice that, because all you have to do to notice that is just observe some mathematical facts. But the easiest way to think about this intuitively, I think, is to imagine what would happen if you actually went through multiple iterations, right? So you can know this without going through the iterations, just as there's many things in mathematics that you can, right? I mean, it's just like, I can add two numbers together without actually counting things up, but you could get the same result by counting things up. And likewise, in this case, you could get the result by like, you know, doing an experiment with a computer, but you could also get the result just by doing some number crunching with some equations.
So let me just get this straight. You don't think that a person who predicts that it's going to continue to produce the same string of numbers over and over again is more justified than the person who doesn't think it will continue to produce the same string of numbers over and over again?
Sorry, who is that question directed to?
Iron?
Yeah, I think, like I said, my intuition is one way, but I don't think that I could justify that, right? Like, Mesler already said that everything that we observe in this reality is consistent with it just being dictated by chance, right? So I don't see how I'd be justified in saying that it is the case that it's not random.
What he said is that's possible, but is it probable?
Right. So there's a different. So like there's two different ways of reaching a conclusion. On the one hand, there are ways of reaching conclusions with deductive certainty, and there's other times when we reach conclusions merely because they're probable, and we don't know them with certainty. And in the case of,
real quick, because I didn't get, like, what your answer was unclear. I asked, is the person justified in thinking that it's going to continue to produce the same numbers over and over again? And it seemed like your answer was no, but is that the case?
Yeah, I'm saying that they wouldn't be like absolutely justified. Maybe in a pragmatic sense, like the conversation, they'd be justified, but I wouldn't say they'd be like logically justified.
Well, of course it wouldn't be logically justified, but there's many things. I mean, having logical justification is a really tall order, and I don't think anyone, whether myself or you know Darth or anyone at all, would have logical justification for making an inductive inference. And that's just because that's not, you know, it's apples and oranges. That's the wrong sort of justification to look for when you're talking about induction.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
it's
I think
not.
that's why he
I don't
characterized
actually
it as a
think.
guess.
I don't actually think. I don't actually think that it is tall in order, right? Because you can put anything into a syllogism. Jay, there.
Well, you can put anything into a syllogism, but that doesn't mean. So look, you can put inductive inferences into a syllogism, and you can put any kind of probabilistic inference you want into a syllogism. But actually, there's rules for when you will determine that a conclusion of a syllogism is probably true.
What I'm saying is like you can have deductive certainty about anything, right? It's just whether or not the premises are true. That's the only thing that's soundness, that's relevant to soundness. So I could say, look, if I pick my nose, then nature is uniform. I picked my nose, therefore nature is uniform, right?
Well, look, that's right. But the question here is about epistemic certainty. So there's lots of different kinds of certainty. One kind of certainty, and the one that I think that we're discussing is.
I understand your concern, right? But I'm just all I want to say is that that's not a tall. I mean, that's not a tall order, right? Like if you ask someone, if someone denied that, right, thought it wasn't true, that's not really the case that they would have anything to appeal to, right? Like. It's not really the case that you could say something like, well, that I mean, I don't know how you justified the implication, right? But I don't know how you would refute the implication either, given something like the uniformity of nature.
Well, so the issue, I take it, is that we can be pretty certain that an argument is valid, but the issue is going to be whether or not the argument is sound, and the kind of certainty that I want to address comes into the level of soundness.
Right.
Maybe I misunderstood you.
Well, you might not even think that that's actually an unsound argument. It depends on what sort of theory of truth you're working with, right? Because
yes, that's right. Yeah, fair enough.
I think that there are theories of truth wherein any true proposition implies another true proposition, right?
Yeah, well, importantly, it implies itself. So I think that that's trivially true.
So you might say that you might think that argument that I gave is a sound argument. Under those.
Oh, right. Yes, but right. That's right. But I think if we were going to give this in response to a presuppositionalist, the issue was how we knew that it was sound.
Well, I don't really see how it's relevant. I would just ask if they denied the argument, right? And if they denied the argument, I would ask why. Because I just wouldn't. I don't think that they have anything that I don't have, right? So I don't think that I don't think that I have the tools to refute that argument. So I don't think that they have the tools to refute that argument. So I just say, yeah, the uniformity of nature is justified by this deductive argument, right? Insert random deductive argument, and then say, well, that justifies that nature is uniform. I mean, if they want to talk about philosophical problems with that, then you might be able to actually engage in an honest discussion with that person, right? Without the whole veil of presuppositionalism. But until that, right, until you're getting that sort of response, I don't think it's pertinent to offer them anything other than that, right? You just say, well, that's, I mean, what are they going to do? They're going to ask, well, what justifies that inference or something like that? What justifies modus ponens? It's like, well, that's not what you asked for. You asked for a justification for nature to be uniform, right? You're not asking for what justifies something like modus ponens. And if they want to start asking those types of questions, just say, well, whatever justifies modus ponens to me is the same thing that justifies it to God. Whatever.
Yeah, well, so I like the kind of technique you're talking about here. It's one where if the you give the presuppositionalist a response, and then if they try to go to some even lower level question, you point out that now they're changing the topic, and you say look, we can talk about this other thing, but I want to mark in the sand here that we're switching gears. It's So if you watch the debate between Shelley Kagan and William Lane Craig,
Yeah, I like that debate.
right, me too. Yeah, so Kagan several times does this kind of technique where like Craig will try to like press him on like some like lower level issue or some like side issue or something, and then Kagan will like take a step back and like summarize what's happened in the discussion. And yeah, I think that's something that I try to emulate, is what Kagan did in that debate.
I mean, it's just not fair when they're not willing to cope with the same skeptical worries, you know.
Right. I mean, they claim to have a solution to the skeptical worries. I don't think it's a very good one, and it's not one that can actually stand up to their own criticisms even.
Well, that's why I was saying that, like, yeah, you can say something like, well, if God exists, nature is uniform, God exists, therefore nature is uniform. But I don't see why that would be any better than, something like, well, if I pick my nose, then nature is uniform. I pick my nose, therefore nature is uniform, right? Not only
Well,
that,
it
but-
sounds like what you're making it into is a kind of like red herring, right? Where like the premise that God exists just has nothing to do with the conclusion. That is to say that the uniformity of nature has nothing to do with God's existence. But I
Well,
think.
listen, I mean, I
Sorry,
mean,
go ahead.
I'm not going to say that they don't think that, right? But I'm not going to say that, like, they might think that, but I think the point is that, well, the same kind of questions that they have, I don't think they're answering. They want to say that they have this omniscient knower, right? But there are questions around that. There are skeptical worries about that, right? Like, well, how does this omniscient knower know things? And how can you get revelation, trust that it's revelation from this omniscient knower, if you don't know their justifications for things, right? So, like, to respond, it's like, well, how does this omniscient knower know that nature is uniform? Because that's what they want to claim, right? And they say, let's say he observes all of nature or something. Well, you say, is that observation not a causal observation? Does that not, you know, assume regularities between the observer's observations and the inferences they draw about that, right? You know, so I really don't think that they're actually answers to the skeptical worries. And so in that way, I'm responding in kind with something that I don't think is actually an answer to the skeptical worry.
Right, okay, I see what you're doing. So because they can't answer the skeptical worry, you don't have the burden of doing so either.
Right, I'm just saying that if that's an acceptable answer to the skeptical worry, then why shouldn't the deductive argument I offered be an answer to that skeptical worry?
Right, I think that that's a fair tactic. Though I want to, just for your edification and for future reference, the reason that they think that God grounds the uniformity of nature is because they think that the natural laws reflect God's mind, and the order in God's mind.
Yeah, but is that a regularity or is that an irregularity?
Oh, right. Well, I think I mean, for one thing, it's a terrible argument because it's because of the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Like you can very easily construct an argument parallel to the Euthyphro dilemma here, and then it's going to turn out that there just is nothing that's going to justify the order of God's mind, or that even would like make it be ordered.
Yeah, is the law of non-contradiction logical, and that's why God accepts it, or is it logical because God commanded it?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so now a lot of them will try to retreat to a more sophisticated view where they'll try to say that the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma, and that it's not due to God's commands alone, but due to some aspect of God's nature, and then like
it's a naturalistic fallacy.
Well, I mean, you can go that way, but another way to go, and what might be sort of more rhetorically useful, is to say, look, it's not clear what this even means. Like what does it mean to say that a nature is logical, or that a nature brings it about that the law of non-contradiction is true? Like I don't, like, I can piece together that sentence, but I have no idea what its content is. And what I deeply suspect is that they don't either.
So I think, like, take an instance. You remember when EF was asking you tonight? He was like, "Well, have you observed all of reality?" And you said no. And then he was like, "Well, how do you know the law of non-contradiction applies at all times and all places if you haven't observed all those times and places or whatever?" Right? Remember he was saying that. Now, imagine that you had observed all times and places. Let's just assume this is coherent for the sake of argument. It doesn't follow from that if there were true contradictions, you're an entity that's capable of observing those things. So even though you had observed all times and places, you still had never observed. You still have never observed the law of non-contradiction. Think about the unaided eye, right? Like you can observe all times and places, but bacteria are small such that without the aid of a telescope, you would not see them. Even though you've observed those places before, you still can't see them, right? So imagine that the law of non-contradiction is like that. Well, God has observed all times and places, and he's seen that there are no contradictions. But why should we think that were there contradictions, God would be capable of observing them?
Right. I mean, I think that there's a skeptical worry here for, you can put this as like the God in a vat worry, which is just to say that most of the skeptical worries that can be raised for human beings, parallel ones can be raised for God, and the presuppositionalist is not going to be able to have a response.
Yeah, that's why I don't really. That's why I'm not really interested in their any response that they offer, right? Because to me, I liken it to an answer of the type that I gave. You know, Lucky, you want to ask me a question?
Yeah, sure. Listen, when Dede talks about the laws of logic, it would appear to me that he's talking about some kind of force that's being applied to what things are, rather than just what you and I would describe as rules of thought, rules of whatever. Do you not get that impression as well? I think Jamie, who's left, touched on it a wee bit, but he's maybe talking about something different to what I think laws of logic actually are.
Right. So I touched on this. He kept saying that the objects in nature. What did he say? He said they conform to the laws of logic or something like this.
Yeah, that kind of sentence. That's a very weird thing to do. Like logic is doing some sort of causal work in constraining objects or something. Yeah, I do get that. That's a weird way to phrase things.
He said many times that the laws of nature are proscriptive, not descriptive. So I'm sure he thinks the same thing about the laws of logic.
Wait, proscriptive or prescriptive?
Prescriptive, proscriptive, whatever.
He presumably means prescriptive. Yeah, he got that shit from Bonson, and like, it's the stupidest fucking thing.